Thank you for coming to this parallel session 2. This is about research workshop on the research of gendered innovations. And we had a good plenary session this morning. You have a general lecture about the gendered innovations principles and methods. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Schiebinger here again to give us another lectures. And then after more lectures, we'll have presentations of 5 very interesting papers. And we have several invited reviewers. And the presentations are not meant to be really complete studies. We had various topics. And then this is just kind of informal discussion. You can just ask any questions, ask any comments. And there, I just talked with them, and they are very open to get any inputs so that they can also give very honest answers, so that we can all improve our knowledge as well as their cases. Okay. Now we'll welcome Dr. Londa Schiebinger again, and she is the leader of this gendered innovations in science and engineering and technology, and she will, I think, do more on the actual methods and then some case examples. Let's welcome Dr. Schiebinger.
Nice to see you again. I'm going to take off where I'm going to start where I left off this morning. So I'll give you more examples of gendered innovations, some of the case studies. So gendered innovations, as I said this morning, really has 2 points. We develop state-of-the-art methods of sex and gender analysis, which I showed you some, and then we provide case studies to illustrate how gender analysis leads to innovation in science and technology. So I want to focus now on some particular methods, and what I want you to appreciate, and I think from our workshop yesterday that people do, is that there's more than one method used in a case study. We developed 12 methods, and you're going to be combining them also with the methods that you use in your research area. So gender is just something that you include in the case study. It's not the entire thing, of course. So I'm going to come back to my story about Google Translate. You remember the basic story that Google Translate defaults to the masculine pronoun. And the point I want to make, that I didn't really have time to make this morning, is that this unconscious gender bias in the present will amplify gender inequality in the future. This is an important point. It turns out that even though Google wanted to fix the problem, they weren't able to do so. One of the Stanford labs worked on the problem for a year, and it's just very complicated. Sometimes it's harder to fix your basic platform if you've already set it than it is to create the proper platform in the beginning. So Google, in having this masculine default, is creating the future. We know that technology, our devices, our programs, and our processes shape human attitudes and behaviors and cultures. So the masculine default in Google Translate reverses this trend toward gender-inclusive language that we had going gradually for 40 years, and it's reinforcing inequality when Google doesn't intend to do that. So by adding more he saids to the web, you're going to get a higher percentage of he saids in the English corpora or body, and therefore you are creating the future and not one that you intended. So this problem is characteristic of machine learning. Machine learning is a type of artificial intelligence that allows programs to learn without being explicitly programmed. That's the whole point. So a machine learning learns by training on a data set. For Google Translate, that data set is the body of all English language texts on the web. And Google Translate defaults to he because if the program consistently chooses he instead of she, it gets a score of 68%. And you want, when you're training your machine, you want it to get the highest score. So, and then as the machine is choosing the he's, because the machine doesn't care, it's then creating bias in the future. So here's the important point. Systems that are trained to make decisions based on historical data will inherit past biases, including gender bias. In other words, past bias is perpetuated into the future even when governments, universities, and corporations have implemented policies to foster equality. So we're all making human decisions to have more gender equality, but these automatic processes are increasing inequalities. So the big question is, how can humans intervene in automated processes to create the society that we want? Most people, most computer scientists, most people consider algorithms objective and free from human influence. So if you talk to Google, they will tell you that they don't edit their search. Of course they edit their search because they don't allow hateful things to come up. They can't have a lot of anti-Semitism on the web. There are things which they edit out, but their claim is that they don't edit search. So their claim would be that this machine learning is completely objective and is not influenced by humans, but of course it is. So we learn by analyzing gender that algorithms, in fact, are not objective, but can influence our society. So here are a few examples of algorithms that are not gender neutral. A search of Google Images for the term CEO returns to you 11% women, when in fact in the United States women are 27% of CEO. And then of course, since the search doesn't know, one of the first CEOs that comes up in these images is the Barbie doll, the Barbie CEO, because Mattel was making dolls to give role models to girls, and they made one called the CEO. So that's what comes up because the machine doesn't know. Okay, a second example is that, and we know that a lot of this machine learning is to return an ad to you, an ad that you will want. So it's a lot of it is about advertising. And one of these programs presents high-paying jobs to men more often than to women. So the machine, again, is making the decision because it's decided that men have higher-paying jobs. So it's not a human decision here, but something that is coming from the algorithms. And then I already presented the Google Translate. So there are now important gendered innovations in progress, and I was very interested to learn about these. Computer scientists are attempting to create mathematically rigorous definitions of fairness to develop and optimize algorithms that guarantee fairness. So one project based at Carnegie Mellon is called the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning, and they're working on ways to recode individual data through intermediate data to control characteristics to thus enhance fairness. So they put a proxy in between the data so that it doesn't just return whether you're a woman, but there are ways to control these things so that the algorithm will work the way that humans would like it to. Another project aimed at online advertising has developed an automated tool called Ad Fisher that companies, companies that offer ads such as Google, Amazon, or Facebook can use this tool to evaluate their advertising to make sure, for example, that women are offered the high-paying jobs as often as the men are. And a third project based at Microsoft is called Fairness Through Awareness, and this seeks to enhance fairness by rethinking the classifications to make sure that individuals are treated similarly. And It's very complicated, all this classification thing, but they are looking at these classifications so that they can return things fairly, so that individuals, if similar individuals are considered similarly. So this is all very new and extremely important. And the goal of these computer scientists is to design algorithms that optimize fairness. And I think that's pretty cool. So for my second example, I want to look at big data and public transportation. I was recently at a seminar in the computer science department at Stanford, and we had a human-computer interaction person from Google talk to us about big data. And during that session, one of the Stanford faculty asked, but isn't data merely captured? It's out there, big data's out there, and we capture it, and then we can analyze it. But the Googler, you'll be happy to know that's what someone who works at Google is called, the Googler said, no, we design our data. So humans collect data, we want to know certain things, we value certain characteristics of people, and we collect that data. So in fact, we are designing the data, and then everyone is studying big data, right? So again, we're getting this kind of loop. So let's look at an example of data collection in urban planning and public transportation. We can use this as an example. Urban planners, and I guess now I'm going to the website, so let me get over there. Okay. And I want to go to this one. Oops, sorry. Okay. Oh, it's not going. Here we go. Okay, so here's an example of data collection and how the values in what is collected determines more or less what you get. Urban planners collect data to understand how people use trains, subways, and bus systems. And here, the gendered innovation is reconceptualizing how data are collected and analyzed. So traditionally, civil engineers collect data in 8 trip categories. These are the traditional categories. So they want to know, why is someone using the metro? This happens to be in Spain. This was done in Madrid by Inés Sánchez de Madariaga. So it is about Spain, but it could be most anywhere. So why are people traveling? And urban planners traditionally collect in these categories. Employment is the #1 thing that people travel for. You want your subway system to work for employment. Education is another one. Shopping, doing the errands, doing your grocery shopping. Leisure, escorting children, taking care of people, for these other things. Now the gendered innovation here is reconceptualizing how this data is collected. So if you're traveling for employment, for instance, you have a certain travel pattern that the buses or the subway wants to optimize. You go from home to work and back again. That's your travel pattern. But we want to conceptualize the data to include caring work. This is a new idea. You're going to collect your data differently. So you want to, again, look at what people are doing for employment, but then caring work, if you take all of the caring work out of these different categories and put them into one category, it becomes the second largest reason why people are traveling. They're taking care of children, they're taking children to daycares, they're taking care of elderly parents, they're doing other kinds of caring work. And when you're doing this kind of caring work, you have a different travel pattern. You go from home to the daycare, on to your job. You might go to the grocery store, you might go to the dry cleaners, you better go to the daycare again, and then you go home. So for urban planning, you have to consider a different type of travel. So none of these, so the main method here, I should say, is reconceptualizing, don't know where I have my method in this, so reconceptualizing our basic concepts and our basic values about how we're collecting data. And it's a very important method that we have. So rethinking basic categories of data collection brings new results. Conceptualizing the mobility of care as a category of analysis is something new and exciting. Incorporating the concept of care incorporating the concept of mobility of care creates more efficient transportation systems, reducing costs and potentially enhancing the quality of life. Now I want to save time for the other presentations, so I think I'll do only one other case study, and that is climate change. Most of our case studies, so climate change is a big issue now, and we want to know, are there gender issues here which are important so that we could, help the environment, that sort of thing. Most of our case studies have a very strong gendered innovation, like the one I showed you on transportation. There's, the mobility of care is the new idea. It is what could bring innovations in urban transportation. We looked really, really hard at climate change, and we found that there are a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions about gender in climate change, and we decided that that was what we should emphasize in this particular case study. Strategies for managing global warming fall into two broad categories: mitigation and adaptation. This case study focuses on mitigation, that is to say, strategies to end global warming. Thus, we treat industrialized countries in this case study because these countries are the major polluters, and mitigation involves strategies to curb greenhouse gas emissions through changes in energy supply, transportation, agriculture, and urban infrastructure, as well as lifestyle. So our question was, how can gender analysis contribute to curbing global warming? Research on the relationship between gender and global warming is still in its infancy. Analyzing gender in this instance means comparing men and women's behaviors and attitudes in relationship to climate change. But we have to ask, which women are we talking about? Which men are we talking about? The gendered innovation in this case develops analytics that combine gender with other social factors, such as income, educational background, and geographic location. It's not enough in this particular case, it's never enough just to look at men and women. You have to bring in these other factors, one of our major methods here, analyzing factors that intersect with sex and gender, and you'll see that in climate change, income is one of the most important factors. So viewing women as an undifferentiated group and opposing this to men as an undifferentiated group, simply disaggregating your data by sex can lead to stereotypes and false correlations. It's important not to fall back on the essentialist stereotype, to assume, for example, that women care more for the environment than men. Women may care, but research shows that their income determines their energy use more than their gendered attitudes and behaviors. So we found, and then we go through a number of these stereotypes here and look at the other factors that you should consider when you're thinking about those particular characteristics. So we found one, let's get rid of that. We found one exemplary study that compared gender and income, and I think that we need more studies like this when we talk about gender and climate change. So this chart shows differences in the energy use between single men and single women in different income categories. So you can't just talk about households because you've got a lot of people in those households. They use single men and single women. And so you can see that this is German data. And you can see that men and women in the same income group have very similar energy uses. So it's the wealthy men and women who are using a lot of energy in these different categories here, food and recreational cultures. And you can see that within the income categories, men and women's use is pretty similar. So these data are interesting because they're sex disaggregated, allowing for a comparison between men and women. And they're also income disaggregated, allowing comparisons between people of different socioeconomic statuses. And they disaggregate by specific forms of energy consumption. So we see that in most categories, men use slightly more energy than women, but that the greatest determining factor for energy use is income. So analyzing gender alone is not enough. Efforts to analyze factors that intersect with gender, including income, age, travel patterns, geographic location, and environmental attitudes, contribute to a better understanding of climate impacts and responses to mitigation measures. This is the direction in which current research needs to move. Understanding gender as it intersects with these other factors may improve mitigation strategies. It may also support efficiency and quality by achieving mitigation at the lowest possible social and economic cost, and by ensuring that costs are shared in equitable ways. So I think I'm gonna stop there so that there's time for other people. I did want to mention that there was a very interesting article. This is the sort of thing I would, what I'm about to say is the sort of thing I would send out on the Gender Innovations listserv. I try not to bother you on that listserv, but I like to send out new studies when they're available. So 2 weeks ago, a new study came out in Nature Climate Change on gender. And I thought, okay, so this ought to be a good one. It's in Nature. And it was very interesting because researchers found that the standards set for air conditioning, indoor air conditioning, like this building, but offices and public spaces, they found that that was set based on the metabolism of male bodies in 1970. And specifically, it was a man from the Netherlands who was 40 years old and weighed 155 pounds or 70 kilos. So that's the metabolic rate that they were talking about. They found that they proposed a method for studying the actual temperature of skin, and they went into great detail about what kind of measures you would use, but they found overall that women, and we can't generalize about all the women, but they, so women in general like it 3 degrees Celsius warmer. Then they connected that to the environment, because if you're not overcooling your buildings, you are going to save energy. Okay, so a couple things about that study. Number one, their study of the skin temperature was great. Their hypothesis about energy savings was, it framed the article. There was no data whatsoever. I think it's interesting, but I wondered, what about the Nordic countries? If you're in Scandinavia, wouldn't you heat the building warmer in the winter time? So I don't know if overall you're going to have an energy savings, but I thought it was a very interesting article and certainly worth consideration.